There are wounds that don't bleed. Reed Calloway had spent 15 years learning the difference between the kind of damage you could see and the kind that lives somewhere deeper in the space between sleep and waking, in the half second before full consciousness arrived and the weight settled back onto your chest like something physical that had been waiting for you to stop moving so it could find you again. He knew both kinds intimately. The visible ones had healed the way visible things do with time and scar tissue, and the body's stubborn insistence on continuing regardless of what the mind would prefer. The other kind was still there, unchanged patient in the way that only permanent things are patient present in the same way that gravity is present, not felt until you try to move against it. He had tried in the 2 years since his discharge to move against it, with varying degrees of commitment and success. He had tried the apartment in Roanoke, which had furniture he had not chosen and walls he had not painted, and a view of a parking structure that reminded him in its gray concrete indifference of certain places he had been paid to visit. He had tried the therapist at the VA, who was a careful woman with a good mind and a genuine investment in her work, and who had observed over the course of their months together that he was systematically reducing his possessions and his attachments in the way you reduce a pack for a long mission, and who had asked him with the precision of someone who knows how to ask the question that matters what mission he thought he was preparing for. He had not had an answer for her. He had been honest about this. It was one of the few things he was consistently honest about in those sessions. He had tried the routine of structured, days-early rising and physical training, and the procurement and preparation of food at regular intervals, all the scaffolding of a functioning life applied to a life that was not yet certain what it was functioning toward. He had tried once a weekend with the men he had served with, which had been good and also excruciating in the specific way of things that remind you of what you had when you no longer have it in the same form. He bought the house in West Virginia on a Tuesday in September without seeing it in person. This was not unusual for Reed. He had made larger decisions on less information in worse conditions with consequences that could not be undone by moving somewhere else or calling a real estate agent. A house was a structure. It either stood or it did not. The photographs online showed something that stood barely but stood, a two-story frame house at the end of a dirt road in the hills of Randolph County, West Virginia, surrounded by hardwood forests that was already beginning its turn toward October color. The listing had been up for 7 months. The price was low enough that he looked at it 3 times, certain he was misreading a digit somewhere, that a zero had been dropped or a decimal misplaced. He was not misreading anything. He wired the money that afternoon before he had time to apply the kind of rational consideration that would have talked him out of it. The woman at the county assessor's office who handled the paperwork had a voice like someone who has answered questions about this particular property before and has grown tired of the answers. "It's been on the market a while," she said, which was a statement of fact delivered in the register of someone who considers elaboration unnecessary. Reed did not ask her to elaborate. He had the address. He had the key code for the lockbox on the front door. He had a truck and a dog and 2 boxes that contained everything he had decided was worth carrying, and that was enough information for the immediate problem of moving from one place to another. He arrived on a Friday evening in the second week of October after 7 hours of driving from the apartment in Roanoke, through the kind of country that gets more serious about itself as you go east and south into the mountains, the landscape demanding more of the roads, and the roads responding by becoming more honest about what they were, winding 2-lane routes that took the terrain seriously rather than fighting it. He had driven with the window cracked for the last 2 hours, the air getting colder and sharper as the elevation climbed, the smell of it changing from the flat neutral of the interstate to something that had wood and water and distance in it. Boone rode in the back seat the way he always rode, alert and still, his dark eyes taking in the changing landscape through the window with the calm assessment of an animal that has learned to read terrain for information and finds the reading itself satisfying. The dog was 4 years old, a German shepherd with the coloring of old wood and shadow, and had been with Reed since the last year of his service, assigned initially as a working animal, and then kept because the paperwork to return him had somehow never gotten filed, and no one had pressed the matter, and Reed had stopped waiting for someone to press it. He was aware that this was the best bureaucratic outcome of his career, and possibly of his life in its current configuration. The house sat at the end of a dirt road that branched off the county route about a mile from the nearest paved surface. The road had a name, Driftwood Hollow Road, printed on a reflective green sign that had taken a glancing blow from something at some point and now pointed at a slightly optimistic angle toward the sky rather than down the road it was meant to indicate. Number 9. Reed had driven past it twice in the dark before the headlights caught it at the right angle. The trees closed in on both sides as he drove in the headlights, making tunnels through the dark, the branches overhead interlocking into something that was almost an arch. The architecture of old growth doing what old growth does when left to its own devices. The forest here was a mixture of oak and maple and hickory and the occasional massive sycamore, and in the daylight he imagined it would be what people who like this kind of thing called spectacular. In the dark, it was simply present, the particular presence of large living things that have been in a place for a very long time and have developed no opinion about your arrival, because your arrival or non-arrival is not information that registers on the scale at which they operate. The house appeared at the end of the road in the sweep of his headlights. It was larger than the photographs had suggested, which was not the direction he had expected to be surprised. The photographs had emphasized the disrepair, because the disrepair was what accounted for the price. The peeling paint on the exterior clapboard, the porch railing that had lost several of its balusters and listed toward the yard at an angle that suggested ongoing negotiation with gravity, the windows with their old single-pane glass that caught the light in the unflattering way of surfaces that had been neglected for long enough to develop opinions. What the photographs had not conveyed was the quality of the structure underneath all of that, the way it sat on its foundation with the settled confidence of something built by people who expected it to stand for 100 years and had not been wrong. The bones were good. Reed knew good bones when he saw them. He had spent his career assessing structures under conditions considerably more stressful than a quiet Friday night in the West Virginia hills. He cut the engine, sat for a moment in the dark of the cab. Boone shifted in the back seat, reading the pause the way he read everything. "Home for now," Reed said. It was the first thing he had said aloud since a gas station outside of Elkins several hours back. His voice sounded slightly unfamiliar in the enclosed space of the cab, the way voices do when they have been unused long enough to have lost their ease with themselves. He got out. The air was cold in the way of mountain evenings in October, with a particular clarity that had no equivalent in the places he had spent the past decade and a half. It smelled of fallen leaves and damp earth and the distant wood smoke of some neighbor far enough away that you could smell their fire but could not hear them. He stood in the driveway for a moment, breathing it in, a thing he was doing deliberately because a therapist had suggested deliberate breathing as a practice, and he had found to his slight annoyance that she was not wrong about its effect. Boone came around the car and sat beside him, also breathing, also reading the air, with the sophisticated equipment of an animal evolved for exactly this kind of assessment in exactly this kind of country. The lockbox on the front door opened on the second try. The key inside was a modern copy hardware store, brass, nothing interesting about it. Reed let himself in and stood in the entryway while his eyes adjusted to the interior dark, and his flashlight found the electrical panel beside the door. The power was on. This was the first good thing about the house, small but not to be dismissed. He moved through the rooms methodically, the way he moved through any new space, cataloging exits and structural features in the particular quality of the silence in each room. 15 years of entering buildings that might or might not be cleared had made this automatic, as involuntary as breathing, and he had stopped trying to override it after the therapist pointed out that the behavior was not the problem, and that trying to eliminate useful adaptations was a different problem. The floors were hardwood, their finish worn through in the traffic patterns of decades of use, and they creaked with the specific eloquence of old wood that has learned to speak. The walls held the ghosts of pictures in slightly different shades of paint, where frames had hung pale rectangles like the memory of what had once occupied them. The kitchen had been updated at some point, which meant it had cabinets that closed fully, and a refrigerator that ran, and a gas range that produced flame on 4 of its 6 burners. 4 out of 6 was a ratio Reed had encountered in considerably more difficult circumstances and had been grateful for. Upstairs there were 3 bedrooms. 2 were entirely empty. The third had been left with a metal frame bed and a mattress wrapped in plastic sheeting, which was either a courtesy from whoever had cleared the house or something that had simply been too inconvenient to remove in the final accounting of the estate. Reed decided it was a courtesy because deciding it was a courtesy cost him nothing and made the room feel more hospitable. He unloaded the car in 2 trips. His entire material life fit in 2 boxes and a duffel bag, plus Boone's supplies in a separate canvas tote. This was not poverty or not only poverty. It was the result of having systematically reduced his possessions over the past 2 years. In the same way you reduce a pack for a mission of unknown duration, keeping only what you would actually carry, setting aside what you were carrying from habit or sentiment rather than genuine need. He had been more aggressive about this process than was strictly necessary. He understood that about himself. The therapist had observed it too and had asked the questions she was trained to ask about what he was trying to prepare for, and he had told her he did not know which was true. He made the bed. He fed Boone. He ate standing at the kitchen counter crackers and peanut butter from a box he had packed specifically for first nights in new places, having learned from experience that the first night was not the night for any operation more complex than basic sustenance. Then he sat on the floor of the empty living room with his back against the wall that had the fewest windows, the tactical position. So ingrained it was simply how he sat when there was no furniture to dictate otherwise. And he watched the dark outside the windows, and he let the house speak. Old houses speak, not metaphorically. The wood of a house that has been standing for decades carries the history of that standing in the way it expands and contracts with temperature, in the way the joists respond to load, in the particular vocabulary of sounds that a given structure produces that is entirely its own and distinguishable from any other house's vocabulary once you have spent enough time listening. Reed had spent years listening to buildings. It was not a skill he had sought. It was what happened to a person who entered enough of them in conditions that required full attention. This house spoke softly. It settled into the cooling night with sounds distributed evenly through its structure, no concentration of stress and weak points, no irregular creak that suggested something giving way. It was a house that knew how to carry what it had been given and was doing it without complaint. Boone slept against his leg. This too was information. The dog's willingness to sleep in a new space was the most reliable indicator Reed had encountered of whether a space was acceptable, and it was more reliable than his own assessment because it was uncontaminated by the human tendency to rationalize discomfort into acceptability. He slept there on this floor with his back against the wall, and in the morning the light through the windows was the clear pale gold of October in the mountains, and the house looked in that light like something worth the low price he had paid for it, impossibly more than that. The first day passed in the functional work of establishing a base of operations. He confirmed the water heater worked. He tested the furnace, which required 3 attempts to convince, and thereafter worked without complaint. He walked the full perimeter of the property in the flat morning light, the cleared acres surrounding the house, giving way to forest on 3 sides, the dirt road the only opening. He noted a collapsed outbuilding near the tree line on the east side, its roof returned to the earth, and a small concrete block structure near the tree line on the west side that was intact and locked, and that he filed away to examine when he had more information about what it might have been used for. He walked the forest behind the house for an hour getting his bearings, letting Boone range ahead and return as the dog's assessment protocol required. The forest was dense and old and going beautifully wrong with October color, the maples in particular burning with a completeness that was almost aggressive in its brightness. He stood in it and breathed and let it be what it was, and tried to let himself be simply a man standing in a forest in October, rather than a man standing in a forest in October with everything he had been carrying for the past 13 years. He was partially successful. Partial success was he had come to understand what success looked like for someone in his situation, and he had stopped expecting the complete version. That evening he stood in the kitchen watching the forest go dark in the way forests do in mountains. Not all at once, but in layers, the upper canopy holding the last light, while the floor went to shadow below. And he made coffee and brought it into the living room, and sat with Boone, and let the house settle around him, and felt something that was not quite peace, but was in the same general territory. On the second night, everything changed. He was unpacking the second box, the one with the photographs he had carried from place to place for 2 years without looking at them directly, setting them face down on the kitchen table as he took them out, because he was not yet ready to be in the same room with them and have them looking back at him when Boone stood up. Not the gradual stand of a dog adjusting position. The complete instantaneous stand of an animal that has received information and is processing it at full attention. Every muscle in the dog's body went to the stillness that is not relaxation, but its opposite. His ears, which normally tracked independently, aimed forward together at a single target. The ceiling. Reed set down the photograph he had been holding without looking at what was in it and looked up. The ceiling of the living room was original plaster, cream-colored and water-stained in the pattern of old leaks that had been addressed at some point, but not forgotten by the surface that had absorbed them. In the center of the ceiling, there was the pull-down mechanism for the attic ladder, a standard folding stair design, its handle a length of rope threaded through a ring. Reed had noted it on his initial sweep of the house and had categorized it as the attic access and had moved on. Taped to the frame of the attic door, precisely centered, placed with a care that was entirely inconsistent with casual or accidental placement, was a piece of paper. Reed looked at it, then he got up. The paper was folded twice and secured with tape that had dried and yellowed to brittleness over what must have been a very long time, years at minimum, more likely decades. The tape had held, despite its age and its brittleness, whatever adhesive quality it had retained, being sufficient to maintain its purpose through seasons of heat and cold and the particular stress that old houses place on everything attached to them. He peeled it away carefully, the way you handle something that looks like it might not survive rough treatment. The paper came away intact, barely its texture compromised by years in the climate of this house, but its structure preserved. He unfolded it. The handwriting was in ink that had been blue once and had faded to a gray, still readable in good light. The letters were formed with care, but not ease, the careful, deliberate formation of someone whose hands were not fully cooperating, but who was determined to be legible, regardless of the cost of the determination. 3 words. Don't open it. Reed looked at the words for longer than they required to read. Then he looked at Boone. The dog was still in his alert posture, still aimed at the ceiling at the attic door and the space above it. Reed folded the note and put it in his shirt pocket. He stood for a moment, running through the variables the way he always did when presented with incomplete information in a situation of uncertain character. The note was old. Whoever had written it was not present. There was nothing in an attic that could harm him in any conventional sense, and he had cleared spaces considerably more fortified than an attic door with a pull rope. The note was an artifact of a previous occupant, left for reasons that were entirely unknown and that might be entirely mundane. Old houses accumulated eccentric artifacts. People left notes. It meant nothing necessarily. He told himself all of this with the systematic thoroughness of someone who has learned not to skip steps in an assessment. Boone whined, a low sound, barely audible, produced in the back of the throat. Reed had heard it a handful of times in 4 years. Once in a parking structure in Kabul that had not been clear. Once outside a building in a city whose name he had decided not to say aloud anymore, because saying it brought things back that he preferred to encounter one at a time rather than all at once. Once when Reed had a fever of 104 and Boone had stayed awake and watchful for 36 hours. The sound meant something. Reed had long since stopped trying to determine precisely what it meant in terms that would satisfy a skeptic and had simply accepted that it was a reliable indicator of a category of situation that warranted his full attention. Not tonight, Reed said. His voice was quiet and steady, the voice of a man who has made a decision. He was not entirely certain what decision he had made. He turned off the light and went upstairs to the bed and lay down in the dark and listened to the house. The house spoke its usual language of cooling wood and settling joinery. He cataloged the sounds the way he cataloged everything, finding their rhythms, building the baseline against which anomalies would register. And then perhaps an hour into the listening he heard it. Not a creak of settling wood. Not the furnace cycling or the pipes making the sounds that pipes make in houses of this age when the temperature drops. Something else entirely. Something that had a rhythm that was not the rhythm of a building doing what buildings do. A slow, deliberate drag across the floor directly above him, followed by a pause of several seconds, followed by the same drag again. It was not an animal sound. It was not the random sound of an object shifting under its own weight. It was controlled. It was purposeful. It was the sound of something being moved with intention by something that had intention. Drag. Pause. Drag. Reed lay still. Every capacity he had trained over 15 years oriented toward that sound, processing it, cataloging its properties the way he cataloged everything. The duration of each drag, the length of each pause, the interval between repetitions. It had a pattern. It was not random. Whatever was producing it was doing so according to some internal logic that he could not yet decode. He did not move. Moving would change what he could hear, and he needed to hear it fully before he did anything else. Boone at the foot of the bed where he had settled lifted his head. He watched the ceiling. He did not bark. He did not growl. He simply watched with the fixed, focused attention of an animal that has identified something it cannot classify and has decided that watching carefully is the correct response until classification becomes possible. The sound came 4 more times and then stopped. The silence that came after it was different from the silence that had preceded it, thicker somehow, more present, as though the silence itself had been doing something while the sound was happening and had not yet returned to its resting state. Reed lay in that silence until the gray of early morning found the edges of the curtains. He did not sleep. He was not afraid. He had been in enough situations that warranted fear to have developed a reliable sense of what fear felt like and what it was warranted by, and this was not that. This was the feeling of encountering something he did not understand, which was different from the feeling of encountering something that was dangerous to him. He had learned to distinguish between them. He filed the sound. He filed the note. He filed Boone's response. He filed the fact that the house had been priced low enough to make him check the listing 3 times before he believed the number. He was beginning to understand that he had bought something more complicated than a house. The second night, the dragging returned at roughly the same hour, lasted roughly the same duration, maintained the same rhythm. Drag, pause, drag. Reed sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and listened to the ceiling and allowed himself to hear it without the interference of interpretation. The interpretation could come later. The listening came first. That was a principle he had carried from his training, the discipline of full reception before response, and it had served him better than almost anything else he had learned. The third night, the fourth, always beginning after midnight, always stopping before 3 in the morning, always the same pattern of drag and pause, the same interval, the same deliberate quality that distinguished it from anything the house itself might produce. By the fifth night, Reed understood that he was not going to simply live alongside this without addressing it. He was not a man who lived alongside things without addressing them. That was not a capacity he possessed in any useful form. He stood at the base of the attic ladder on the fifth night and looked at the note. He had been looking at it in different ways since he found it in different qualities of light, at different times of day, holding it at different angles, reading the 3 words, and reading what he could of what was underneath the 3 words. He had been approaching it the way he approached anything he did not yet understand, with patient, sustained attention, applied from multiple directions. On the fifth night, he carried it to the kitchen and held it directly under the overhead light. There was something on the back. He had suspected this. He had been unable to confirm it in the light of the living room, which was not good enough for the kind of looking it required. In the kitchen light, holding the paper at a specific angle that caught the faded remnant of ink at the point of maximum contrast, he could see it. 1 word, written in the same hand as the front, the same ink but smaller. The letters even more uncertain than the ones on the front, as though the act of writing had cost more than the writer had anticipated or had been performed in a state of greater difficulty. The ink was so faded that the word existed at the very edge of visibility, pressing its ghost through the paper from whatever year it had been written. Please. Not a warning that had acquired a second sentence. Not an explanation. Not a name or a date or any of the things that would have made it more comprehensible. A single word of asking. Someone had written a warning on the front of a piece of paper and then in a different moment or a different state had turned the paper over and written asking on the back as though the warning had been placed first and the asking had come later from somewhere deeper. Reed stood at the kitchen table for a long time. Boone sat by his feet and watched him with the calm patience of an animal that has learned that certain kinds of human stillness require waiting and that waiting is a thing he is entirely capable of. Reed put the note back in his shirt pocket. He went to the pull rope of the attic ladder. He had been going to this moment for 5 days without quite arriving at it, circling it the way you circle something You are not yet ready to approach directly taking readings from a safe distance until the readings tell you that the distance itself is the problem. He understood now, standing with the rope in his hand, that he had been working up to this since he read the 12 words on the note, the 3 on the front and the 9 he was reading into the 1 on the back. He had not bought this house for the reasons he had told himself. He had bought it because something in the listing and the low price and the long vacancy and the photograph of the forest behind it, taken in a season of maximum color, had spoken to something in him that did not respond to rational persuasion. He had moved toward it the way he had always moved toward things that were trying to tell him something important, before his mind had finished deciding whether to listen. He pulled the rope. The ladder came down with a sound that was almost a sough, the long exhalation of something that has been held in place for a long time and has finally been released to move. The air that descended from the attic was cold and still, and carried the smell of closed space and old wood, and something underneath, though something that was not decay, but was in the same family, the smell of time that has not moved, that has stayed in place rather than flowing forward. Reed put his foot on the first rung. Boone was already past him. The dog went up the ladder with a speed and certainty that Reed had not seen in 4 years of watching him move. Not the controlled speed of a working dog executing a trained behavior. The urgency of an animal who has been waiting for a particular moment and will not be impeded now that it has arrived. By the time Reed reached the top and pushed the attic door fully open, Boone was in the far corner of the space at the lowest angle of the roof, and he was pressed against the front of a large wooden chest, and he was trembling, and he was looking back at Reed with an expression that Reed had no precise language for, but understood in the way you understand things that bypass the language centers entirely and arrive somewhere more fundamental. Reed swept his flashlight through the attic. The space was low and long, running the full width of the house, populated with the accumulated residue of a life lived here over many decades. Cardboard boxes gone soft with moisture and age. A metal folding chair with one rubber foot missing, leaning against a rafter. A smaller wooden trunk, open and empty, its lid propped at an angle that suggested it had been checked and found to contain nothing of significance. Lamps without shades. A collection of mason jars on a shelf, empty and dusty. The kind of accumulation that happens when people defer the sorting of things that seem like they might matter later, and later keeps arriving without the sorting ever occurring. None of that was what Reed was looking at. The floor of the attic in the area between the ladder opening and the wooden chest in the far corner where Boone was stationed bore marks. Not the random marks of objects moved once or twice. Deep scratches in the old pine flooring, parallel and overlapping, running from roughly the center of the attic floor to the front of the chest in patterns that told an unmistakable story. Someone had moved something heavy from that position to the corner and back again, and had done it not once or twice, but many times, enough times that the floor carried the cumulative record of every repetition. The scratches ran in both directions to the corner and back toward the center, the record of a return trip as well as the outward journey. Whatever was in that chest had been moved to that corner and back again over and over by someone who needed it to be there. Reed crossed to the chest. Boone shifted to let him crouch in front of the lock, and then pressed back against his side, trembling, but steady, present in the way the dog was present when Reed needed him to be present. The padlock was substantial, the kind designed to discourage rather than merely inconvenience, and it was rusted with age, and it was still engaged. Reed examined it with the attention of someone who has dealt with locked things in conditions that did not favor careful examination and who has learned from that experience to assess quickly and accurately. He went back down the ladder. He found the tools he had packed, because you packed tools when you moved somewhere that was going to need them, and he came back up. The metal gave with a sharp crack that echoed through the attic and then dissolved into the waiting silence. Reed's hands were not shaking. He noted this as information, the way he noted all information, because what the hands do when you are doing something tells you what the body thinks about what the mind is doing, and it is often more honest than the mind's own account of the situation. He put both hands on the lid of the chest. He lifted it. The smell was the first thing, and it was not what he expected. Not decay, not the sharp wrongness of organic matter in the final stages of its dissolution, the smell he had encountered in places he did not name to himself in quiet hours. This was different, older, more patient. The smell of air that had been enclosed and separated from the ordinary movement of the world for a very long time, The smell of preserved stillness of a space that had been doing its best to protect what it contained from the indifferent damage of years with the limited tools of wood and metal and the careful layering of cloth. Reed held the lid and looked. Blankets, folded with precision, layered one on top of another, in the way of someone who understood that layering was protection, and that each additional layer was another buffer between the contents and whatever the years might bring. He counted 7 of them before he understood that the counting was a way of delaying what came after them. And he stopped counting and began lifting them out one by one, folding each one again, before setting it on the attic floor, handling them with the automatic care of someone trained to treat objects as potentially significant before he knows whether they are. The 6th blanket was different, smaller, lighter, made of a material that had once been soft and bright and was now faded toward the pale neutrality that long darkness produces in colored things. It had a pattern, small shapes repeated across its surface, something that had been cheerful once. Reed held it for a moment before setting it with the others. He knew what this was. He knew the category of the object it belonged to before he knew anything else about it. Under the 7th blanket was a stuffed bear, small, perhaps 8 inches from the top of its round head to the bottom of its round feet, made of material that had once been plush and was now worn to a smoothness that recorded the history of how it had been handled, the particular erosion of a beloved object, the places where small hands had gripped it, most often worn to a different texture than the places touched less frequently. One of its glass eyes was slightly loose in its setting. The other was fixed and caught the beam of Reed's flashlight, with the unsettling quality of glass in dark spaces the illusion of attention. Reed picked it up. It was lighter than he expected, the stuffing compressed over decades into something denser and less evenly distributed than it had originally been concentrated in the places where the outside pressure had been least. He held it in one hand and looked at it and felt something move through him that he had spent 2 years successfully suppressing, a precise and undefended awareness of smallness of the scale of a thing made specifically for small hands, of what it meant that such a thing existed and was here. He set it carefully on the folded blankets. Beneath where the bear had rested was a photograph face down. Reed turned it over. It was a 4x6 print made from film, the particular quality of color and light and grain that belonged to a specific era before digital imaging changed what photographs looked like. A child stood in front of a house. A girl. She was perhaps 7 years old, dressed in a blue winter coat, her dark hair in 2 braids that were already in the process of escaping whatever had tied them at the beginning of the day. She was holding the bear, the same bear that was now resting on the folded blankets beside him, pressing it against her coat with the confident possession of someone holding something that is unambiguously and permanently hers. She was smiling at the person holding the camera with the complete and unperformed smile of a child who knows and trusts whoever is behind the lens. Not a smile produced for a camera. A smile produced for a person who happened to have a camera. The house behind her was this house. Reed recognized it in the first moment of looking the angle of the roofline, the porch railing, the old sycamore, at the left edge of the frame, smaller in the photograph than it was now, but already distinct in its character. He turned the photograph over. The handwriting on the back was the same handwriting as the note, the same careful compromised letters, the same faded ink, the same quality of determined legibility produced against physical difficulty. 4 words. She's still here. Reed did not move for a long time. Boone was pressed against his legs, sitting very still. The trembling stopped. The dog was not looking at the chest or at the photograph or at Reed. He was looking at the far corner of the attic, the deep angle where the pitch of the roof met the floor, the place where the darkness was complete and the beam of the flashlight did not reach. Reed followed the dog's gaze. There was nothing visible in the corner, nothing his eyes could find or his flashlight could illuminate in any way that would have satisfied a request for evidence. But the air in that part of the attic was different, and Reed was a man who had learned over 15 years to trust his perception of the air in enclosed spaces, its temperature and its weight, and the way it moved or failed to move around things that occupied it. He had trusted this perception in buildings where the trusting of it had been the margin between one outcome and another. He did not distrust it now simply because the situation was unfamiliar. He was not afraid. He had examined this question carefully in the 5 nights of dragging sounds and had arrived at the clearest assessment he could make. He was not afraid. What he felt occupied a different region of his interior landscape, one adjacent to grief, but not grief, adjacent to recognition, but not recognition. He was in the presence of something that had been waiting for a very long time to be in the presence of someone, and the something was not malevolent and was not dangerous and was not making any demand of him except the demand of acknowledgement. He looked at the photograph, at the girl's face, at the bear she held. "I hear you," he said. His voice was low, not a whisper which would have been a performance, not a command voice which would have been wrong. The voice of a man speaking to something he was not certain would hear him, but was speaking anyway because speaking was the correct thing, and he was going to do the correct thing. The air in the corner did not change in any way he could measure, but something in the quality of the attic's silence shifted in the way that silence shifts when it has received something it has been waiting for. Reed sat on the attic floor with his back against the chest and Boone pressed warm against his side, and he stayed. He did not go to the corner. He did not search the chest further. He simply stayed in the space and breathed its old air and let it be what it was and let himself be present with it, patient and without demand, waiting in the way he had learned to wait in places where waiting was the operationally correct choice. When he went back down the ladder an hour later and into the ordinary air of the house's second floor, he carried the photograph with him. He left the bear in the chest on the folded blankets. It belonged there. He did not sleep that night, but the dragging sound did not return. In the morning, he sat at the kitchen table with the photograph face up in front of him and his coffee getting cold beside it, and he thought about what he was going to do. He was not a man who processed things through symbol or feeling first. He processed things as information, which meant he needed more information before he could understand what he had or what it asked of him. He had a photograph of a child taken in front of this specific house some unknown number of years ago. He had a note in aged handwriting that said the child was still here. He had 30 years of evidence on the attic floor that someone had been returning a heavy chest to the same position over and over until they could not anymore. He had a chest packed with careful layers that told the story of someone who understood that the things inside it were worth protecting. These were data points. They pointed at a story. He needed the rest of the story. He drove into Elkins. The county seat was 40 minutes on roads that took the terrain seriously, winding through the hills in the pragmatic manner of routes established by people who walked them before anyone drove them. Reed had made the drive twice before on supply runs and now made it with the automatic competence of someone who memorizes routes as a matter of practice. The county assessor's office was in the courthouse on the main street, a brick building constructed in an era when public buildings were expected to communicate permanence. Reed went to the records window and asked for the ownership history of 9 Driftwood Hollow Road. The clerk pulled it without comment. The record went back to 1962. The property had been purchased in that year by a man named Thomas Whitfield. It had remained in Thomas Whitfield's name until 2021, when it was transferred to the county following 2 years of unpaid taxes. Thomas Whitfield had died in 2019. Reed looked at the dates. 57 years. Thomas Whitfield had owned the property for 57 years from 1962 until his death in 2019, living in it, or at least maintaining his claim to it, until his body could no longer make the case for staying. He asked where archived local newspapers were kept. The library 2 blocks east. The library's archive room held the Randolph County Chronicle on microfilm from 1948 forward and in bound paper volumes from 1985. A librarian named Harold, perhaps 60, wearing a cardigan that had seen better decades and appeared perfectly content with this set, read up at the microfilm reader, with the patience of someone who has learned that the most useful thing he can offer people who are looking for things they don't quite know how to ask for is patience. Reed started in October 1989 and moved forward. He found it in the November 7th, 1989 edition. The headline was above the fold, "Missing Girl Search Continues for Clara Whitfield." 7 below the headline, a photograph, a school photograph, plain blue background, the girl in the image arranged by whoever photographed her to present her best face to the record. Her hair in 2 braids. Her expression, the particular expression of children who have been asked to smile for a camera and are doing their sincere best. He recognized her. He read the article with the attention he brought to documents that required it. Clara Whitfield, 7 years old, had been reported missing on the afternoon of October 28, 1989. She had last been seen in the yard of the family home at 9 Driftwood Hollow Road playing in the fallen leaves at the edge of the forest at the back of the property. Her father, Thomas Whitfield, had been inside and had checked on her through the back window at approximately 2 in the afternoon. When he went to the door 20 minutes later, she was not there. Search and rescue teams had searched the surrounding forest for 8 days without finding any trace. 20 minutes. Reed sat with that. The distance between present and absent measured in 20 minutes. The space in which everything changes and nothing can be done to change it back. He read the subsequent issues. The search extended through November. Clara's name appeared on the front page twice more, and then moved inside the paper and then stopped appearing. A brief item in March 1990 noted the investigation remained open. A small notation in 1996 recorded the reclassification as a cold case. Thomas Whitfield's obituary appeared in the October 2019 issue. It was brief. Thomas Edward Whitfield, 79, died at home on October 14, 2019. He was preceded in death by his wife Margaret and his daughter Clara. No surviving family. He had worked as a carpenter for 3 decades. He had kept to himself. There were no services. Burial was private. Reed looked at the date, October 14th. Clara had disappeared on October 28th. Thomas had died 2 weeks before the 30th anniversary of the day his daughter had vanished from the yard of the house he had refused to leave. He had waited 30 years. He had packed a chest with layers of blankets and placed a stuffed bear and a photograph at its center, and dragged it back to the same corner of the same attic so many times that the floor bore the full record of every repetition. He had written a note and taped it to the attic door with tape that outlasted the brittleness that age gave it. And he had died in the house where he had last seen his daughter alive 2 weeks before the anniversary of her disappearance in the month of October, surrounded by the same October forest that had taken her. Reed returned the microfilm to Harold. Outside, the October morning was cold and bright, the sun at work on the colors of the trees. He stood on the courthouse steps and held what he had learned and let it settle into its proper shape before he did anything else with it. A mile before his turnoff on the drive back, he saw a mailbox with Pruitt painted on it in carefully maintained letters. The house behind it was a small farmhouse with an intact kitchen garden, the garden of someone who knew what they were doing and did not leave things unfinished. He turned in. Agnes Pruitt came to the door before he had finished knocking, which told him she had been watching from somewhere inside. She was perhaps 74, a small woman who carried her age the way well-made things carry their use present, but not burdensome. She looked at him with the direct assessment of someone who has spent decades living alone at the end of a rural road and has developed reliable judgment about the people who come to her door. "I'm Reed Calloway," he said. "I bought the Whitfield place." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not surprise, something more considered than surprise. Then she opened the door wider and stepped back. "I wondered when someone would," she said. She made coffee without asking, and they sat at a kitchen table worn and solid under years of use. Agnes wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at him and waited. He told her what he had found. The note and its 3 words and the 1 word on its back. The sounds over 5 nights. What the chest contained. The marks on the attic floor. The photograph and the 4 words on its back. What the microfilm at the library had given him. What the obituary had said about October 14th and 30 years in a man who kept to himself. She listened without interrupting, which was a form of respect he recognized and appreciated. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the surface of her coffee. "Thomas was my neighbor for 40 years, she said. Before Clara, he was a man you would not have noticed particularly. Quiet, competent, good neighbor. He helped me put a new roof on my kitchen addition in 1986 and did not mention it again after it was done. After Clara, he was a different kind of man. Not broken exactly. The word I kept coming back to was chosen. He chose to stay in that house when he could have left. He chose to believe she was still connected to it in some way he didn't try to explain to me. He chose to keep the chest where she could find it if she came back for it." She looked at Reed directly. "He told me about the chest," she said. "Not what was in it. He said he'd put things in it that mattered, and he asked me not to let anyone disturb it. I didn't go into that house after he died." She paused. "I'm glad it was you who went in, rather than someone who wouldn't have known what they were holding." Reed thought about what it meant to be the person who came, rather than someone else. He thought about the low price and the 7 months on the market in the photograph of the October forest that had spoken to something in him he hadn't been able to name. He had one more question. The note on the attic door, he said, "Don't open it." Who was he writing it for? Agnes considered this for a long time before answering, which told him she had thought about it before and had arrived somewhere careful. "I think at first he was writing it for himself," she said. "When it was too much to go up there, he'd write a new one when the old one wore out, as though the writing of it was what he needed each time, not just the having of it. And then later when he knew someone else would be in that house after him, I think he left the last one for whoever that would be. A warning and an invitation at the same time." She looked at him. "Some things you have to work up to," she said. Reed drove back to the house on Driftwood Hollow Road in the afternoon gold of an October in the West Virginia hills. He drove slowly, taking in what the trees were doing with the light, letting himself see it. Boone met him at the front door and pressed against his leg, briefly checking, and Reed held his hand on the dog's head for a moment. Then he went up to the attic. He climbed the ladder in the afternoon light, pulling the attic door fully open so the light from the hallway below could reach into the space and reduce the darkness to angles rather than totality. In this light, the attic looked different from the nights he had listened to it from below. Smaller, more ordinary. The objects in it resolved from shapes that had seemed significant in the dark into simply the objects they were, the residue of a long life lived with careful attention. He went to the chest and sat down on the floor beside it. He took the photograph from his jacket pocket, where it had been since that morning, and held it in both hands and looked at the girl in the blue coat. Clara Whitfield, 7 years old, in the yard of a house she would not see again after October 28th of the year the photograph was taken. Holding her bear, looking at her father through the lens with the complete trust of a child who has no reason yet to understand that trust can be misplaced by the world even when the person trusted has done nothing wrong. Her father had packed this chest with 7 blankets, or to protect what was inside from the indifference of time. Had dragged it back to its corner again and again for a reason. Reed now understood the way you understand things that live in the same territory as your own private, incomprehensible behaviors. The things you do that you cannot explain to anyone because explaining them would require explaining everything underneath them. And everything underneath them is what you have never found words for. Reed put his back against the chest and looked at the low ceiling above him, the boards of the attic's underside, the underside of the roof that Thomas Whitfield had lived beneath for 57 years. He opened his mouth. He had spoken in difficult situations before. He had spoken to men in the middle of things that did not favor speech, had used language as a tool applied with precision, when precision was what the moment required. He knew how to do that. It was not what this moment required. She was real, he said. Clara, your daughter. She was real and she was here and she mattered. He stopped. The words were right, but they were only the beginning of the right words. Thomas kept everything she left behind, he said. He kept it the way you keep things that are worth keeping. Because they are. Because she was. The attic was quiet. Boone had settled against his side, the trembling, fully resolved, his weight warm and steady. Reed had not said the next words to anyone. He had carried them in the place where things live that you have decided are not available for examination, and they had been there long enough that he had stopped registering their weight separately from his own weight. They had become part of what he was rather than something he was carrying. I know something about carrying someone, he said, about not being able to put them down. He breathed. There is a man whose name I have not said out loud in a long time. His name was Sawyer Holt, and he was the best operator I ever had the privilege of working alongside, and I could not reach him in time, and I have been carrying the fact of that every day since November of 2011. The afternoon light shifted as something passed over the sun outside, and the attic dimmed briefly and then recovered. I hear you, Reed said. I hear what your father was trying to tell whoever came here after him. That you were here, that you were real, that someone should know. He looked at the photograph one more time. Then he placed it carefully back on the folded blankets, the bear beside it, and closed the chest lid, gently closing it, the way you close something that contains what matters, and left it where Thomas had always returned it. He went back down the ladder. He had to find Lou Granger. It took 2 days and 3 phone calls. The Randolph County Sheriff's Office told him Granger had retired in 2008, and they could not provide personal contact information. The Elkins Police Department told him the same thing. Agnes Pruitt told him what he needed on the 3rd call because Agnes Pruitt knew the connective tissue of this county, the way people know things they have spent 7 decades paying attention to. He lives out on Tigert Valley Road, she said. Tan house with a green metal roof. You'll know it because there's a carved wooden bear on the porch that his son made him. It's approximately the size of an actual bear. Reed found it on the first pass. He sat in the truck before getting out running the variables. Granger was 78 years old, retired 15 years, and had spent the better part of 3 decades before that working missing persons and violent crimes in a rural county where such cases carried a weight their statistics did not suggest. He had worked Clara Whitfield's case from the day it opened until it was reclassified and possibly beyond, in whatever capacity a man has to keep working something after the institution has officially moved on. Reed did not know which kind of carrier Granger was, the kind for whom revisiting was a relief, or the kind for whom it was an excavation. The carved bear on the porch was, as Agnes had indicated, impressively large. Someone who understood what they were doing with a chainsaw and had a good eye on had transformed a substantial section of tree trunk into something that captured the attitude of a black bear at rest, present and unhurried and entirely comfortable with its own stillness. Reed spent a moment with it before he knocked. He respected good work regardless of medium. The man who answered the door was tall, or had been, with the slight forward adjustment that comes from decades of looking at things at desk height. He was lean and white-haired and had the eyes of someone who spent a long career looking carefully and could not turn that off in retirement because it was no longer a skill, but a character. "You're not from here," he said. An observation, not an accusation. "No," Reed said. "Reed Calloway. I bought the Whitfield property on Driftwood Hollow Road." Something moved through Granger's face that was not surprise. The expression of a man who has been anticipating something without knowing the form it would take. "Come in," he said. The interior of the house had the specific character of a space shaped entirely by one person's preferences over a long period of time. Books in the living room sorted according to a system Reed could not immediately decode. A fly-tying setup at a work table near the window where the light was best for it. Photographs on the mantel, a woman at various ages, children becoming adults across the span of images, the visual record of a life that had kept moving. And on the desk in the corner, a manila folder that had been opened recently enough that its contents had not been returned to their storage configuration. Granger saw Reed look at it. "Agnes called me," he said. "Last night." They sat. Granger did not offer coffee, which Reed read as the choice of a man who wanted to get to what mattered without the ritual of hospitality first. Reed respected that. He laid out what he had found in the order he had found it. The note and its message, and the message on its back. The sounds over 5 nights. The chest and what it contained and how its contents had been arranged, and what the floor of the attic told him about the history of the chest's placement. The photograph and its 4 words. The library and what the microfilm had given him and what the obituary had said. Agnes and what she had told him about the kind of man Thomas had been after Clara disappeared. Granger listened with the complete stillness of someone for whom listening fully before responding was professional discipline that had become personal character. When Reed finished, Granger was quiet. Then he said, "Thomas called me. 1994, 5 years after. He asked for me specifically, and I took the call. He told me he did not believe Clara was dead. He believed she was still in some way connected to that house. I was a detective. I worked with what could be established, and what he was describing could not be established in any way the job recognized." He paused. I listened to him completely. I told him I had not closed the case in my own mind. That was the truest thing I could say. That was also something he could hold on to. He thanked me and hung up, and I did not hear from him again. Reed set Thomas Whitfield's notebook on the table between them. Granger looked at it without touching it. 30 years of it, Reed said. I want you to read it. Granger opened the cover. Reed watched him read for 40 minutes. He looked at the photographs on the mantel, while he waited, the woman at different ages, and then the children, and then the grandchildren. The accumulation of a life that had kept going while other things stayed exactly where they were. When Granger closed the notebook, he put both hands flat on its cover and looked at the table. He wrote down everything Granger said. Every sound, every time he went up there. He paused. He writes about why he kept putting the chest back in the corner. He thought she would know where to find it. He was keeping a light on for her. He looked up. I have a file, he said. Everything from the official investigation. And something else. He went to the desk and brought back several pages of careful handwriting and laid them beside the notebook. It was a summary of everything Granger had done to continue working the case after it went cold in 1996. Interviews conducted on his own time. Geographic analysis of the original search noting areas inadequately covered due to weather and resource limits. The most recent entry was dated 2014. The final line read, "No resolution. Case remains the most significant failure of my career. She deserved better from all of us." Reed read it twice. "What do you want to do with this?" he said. Granger was quiet in the way of a man who has been waiting for that question. "There is a state cold case review unit," he said. "I have contacted them twice. Both times the case did not meet the threshold for active review. No new physical evidence." He looked at the notebook. "This is not physical evidence in the legal sense, but it is 30 years of documented account by a man who was present in that house. And it documents Clara Whitfield as a person, who she was before October 28th. Thomas wrote about her in the early pages the way a man writes about something he is terrified of forgetting." Reed had not yet read the early entries. He had started from the end. He would go back to the beginning. "I can write a formal statement," Reed said, "documenting what I found and in what condition. I know how to write a statement that will be read seriously." Granger looked at him for a long time. "Military," he said. "Not a question. 15 years. Navy." Granger nodded slowly. "We carry the ones we couldn't get to," he said. "No procedure for it. You just carry them." Reed did not answer immediately. "Yes," he said. Granger picked up the notebook. "I'll contact the cold case unit again," he said. "With your statement in this, I can't promise a different outcome. But Clara Whitfield will be in an active file maintained by someone whose job it is to maintain it." "That is what Thomas was asking for," Reed said. "Someone to keep the record. Someone to keep saying she was here." He drove back to Driftwood Hollow Road in the early evening, the October light withdrawing from the valleys, while the upper slopes still held it, the trees in their last hour of brightness before the cold of the night came down. He drove with the window open and the cold air finding him and let it. He parked and sat for a moment looking at the house. It stood in the early evening with the solidity of something that has been through a great deal and has decided that standing is simply what it does. He had been looking at it for 10 days now from this driveway, and each time it resolved slightly differently as his understanding of it deepened. It was not a frightening house. It never had been. It was a house that had held a particular grief for 30 years and had held it faithfully and had been waiting for someone who could understand what it was holding and treat it accordingly. He had been that person. He had not chosen it deliberately. He had simply been the one who came. Inside, he sat at the kitchen table and took out his phone. He had the number. He had looked it up 2 years ago and again 6 months ago and again 3 months after that, and had done nothing with it on any of those occasions, had put the phone down each time before the call connected. He had the number in his contacts under a name he had not opened. Holt M. Miriam Holt, Sawyer's mother, a woman in Billings, Montana who had received a flag and a uniformed officer at her door in November 2011 and had been receiving nothing from Reed Calloway in the years since, despite what he owed her, which was everything, and despite what he could offer her, which felt like nothing, and despite the fact that the nothing he could offer was still more than the silence he had given her. He had been working up to this for 13 years. He pressed the contact. The phone rang 3 times. "Hello?" A woman's voice. Older than some part of him had expected, though he had known she would be in her mid-70s now. A voice with the careful texture of someone who has answered phones for a long time, managing the moment of not yet knowing who is calling. "Mrs. Holt," he said. "My name is Reed Calloway. I served with your son." The silence that followed was not the silence of someone who had hung up. It was the silence of someone who had gone very still. "I was with Sawyer," Reed said. "In 2011. He paused. "I have wanted to call you for a long time. I should have called before now. I'm sorry that I didn't." The silence held for another moment. Then Miriam Holt said in a voice that contained things he could not fully identify but that he recognized, "I know your name. Sawyer talked about you." Reed pressed the phone against his ear and said nothing, because nothing he could say would be adequate to what she had just given him, and he was finished pretending that inadequate responses were sufficient. He talked about all of them, she said, but you specifically. He said you were the best he'd worked with. Reed's jaw tightened, the physical response of a man managing something that is trying to find its way out through his face. He was, Reed said. He was the best I ever worked alongside. I want you to know that. She was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something, she said. Yes. Did he know at the end that the people who served with him would carry him? Reed thought about Thomas Whitfield in 1994, picking up the phone and calling the only person who might understand what he was holding. He thought about what it meant to carry someone, the specific weight of it, the way it moved with you everywhere, and did not become lighter with time, but did become something you learned to move with. Yes, Reed said. He knew. She made a sound that was not a word. Reed sat with it and did not try to manage it or redirect it or make it easier. He held the phone and let the moment be as large as it was. They talked for 27 minutes. Reed told Miriam Holt specific things about her son, things that were true and that she did not have, and that belonged to her. He told her about Sawyer's particular quality of calm in situations that actively discouraged calm, how he had the capacity to find what was steady in any circumstance and anchor himself to it and let other people anchor to him. He told her about Sawyer's way of finding the one thing that could be honestly called funny in situations that were otherwise not, and finding it without making light of anything that deserved to be taken seriously. He told her about a conversation they had had driving through Afghanistan in which Sawyer had described going home to Montana when he was done buying horses, building a fence with his father, and the specificity of his description had been striking. The breed of the horses, named their colors, described the length of the fence, measured the color of the paint, chosen as though he had already been there in some part of himself that was waiting for the rest of him to catch up. When he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table with the phone in his hand. Boone came from wherever he had been and pressed against Reed's leg and stayed. Reed breathed. The kitchen was quiet around him, and the house was quiet around the kitchen, and the forest was quiet around the house. The specific layered quiet of a place that is very far from the sounds that had occupied the interior of his life for a long time. He went upstairs to the attic. He climbed the ladder in the dark, his hands finding the rungs from memory. At the top, he did not use his flashlight. He sat in the dark of the attic with his back against the chest and let the dark be the dark without asking anything of it. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the piece of paper he had written on that morning before he drove to Granger's house, sitting at the kitchen table with deliberate attention, understanding that writing a thing and thinking a thing are different operations with different results. Two names, Clara Whitfield, Sawyer Holt. He opened the chest by feel, lifting the lid, folding back the blankets until his hand found the smooth, worn shape of the bear. He put the paper under the bear, between the bear and the photograph where it would be held by the weight of what surrounded it. He closed the lid. He sat in the dark of the attic of 9 Driftwood Hollow Road and listened to the silence. It was not the silence of an empty apartment. It was not the operational silence of controlled environments where silence is itself a kind of noise. It was the silence of something that had found its condition. The silence of a chest that held what it needed to hold. The silence of names that had been said aloud and written down and placed somewhere they would be kept. Reed had learned in 15 years of work that required him to function in the presence of things that had no resolution. That resolution was not always the available outcome. That sometimes the correct action was not to solve but to witness, not to fix but to acknowledge, not to close but to tend. Thomas Whitfield had tended this space for 30 years, had dragged a chest to a corner enough times that the floor bore the full record of it, had written down every sound and every sensation and every small evidence of a presence he could not prove but would not deny, had not stopped until his body stopped him, and had left before that, stopping a note that was a warning and an invitation for whoever came after. Reed had come after. He had not been looking for this. He had been looking for the absence of things, for the quiet where the accumulation of years of noise could disperse. He had bought a house at the end of a dirt road because it was quiet and affordable, and very far from the places that held the textures of everything he had seen and done and failed to do. He had found something quiet in the specific way of things that have been waiting a long time to be heard, and he had heard it. And in hearing it, he had done what Thomas Whitfield had spent 30 years trying to do, which was not to solve or explain, but simply to maintain the record. to keep saying she was here, to refuse the alternative. The attic was still. Boone was downstairs. The dog's assessment was apparently complete, his sophisticated instrument having registered something that allowed him to rest. Reed sat in the dark for a long time. He thought about Miriam Holt's voice saying Sawyer talked about you. He thought about Thomas writing in his notebook by whatever light he had available, his hands unsteady, his intention steady. He thought about Clara in her blue coat on a morning in 1989 that had been ordinary until it wasn't. He thought about the things that are carried and the things that carry us and the sometimes very small distance between them. Outside, the October night had settled fully over the hills of Randolph County, West Virginia. The forest was in its late-season stillness, the trees holding what was left of their color against the coming of November, doing what trees do in October, burning as brightly as they can before letting go. He did not hear the dragging sound that night, or the following night, or any night after that. The attic was quiet in the way places are quiet when they have been heard. He went up there sometimes in the weeks that followed. Not every night, not with urgency. He went the way you return to a place that has given you something and that you want to continue being present with. He would sit beside the chest in the dark or in the morning light that found its way through the small gable vent, and he would sit for a while and he would feel the specific quality of the place, and then he would go back down and continue the work of making the house his. There was considerable work. Reed discovered he was good at it in ways he had not known or had not tested in any context that allowed knowing. He could follow the logic of a structure, understand what it needed, and in what order apply the sequence of repairs with the same methodical patience he had applied to sequences that required more from him. He fixed the porch railing and replaced 3 north-facing windows and addressed the gutters and made the concrete block outbuilding serviceable as a workshop, which gave him a place to do the detailed work that needed better light and better air than the house's interior on cold days. He drove into Elkins twice a week. He spent time at the library with Harold, who had considerable knowledge of local history and an inexhaustible willingness to share it with someone paying genuine attention. He spoke with Agnes Pruitt more than he had anticipated needing to, and her dinner invitations issued without ceremony and accepted without excessive gratitude became something he found he was looking forward to in the way that a man who has not been looking forward to things looks forward to the first ones that appear. Granger called in the 3rd week of November. The cold case review unit had agreed to open a review of Clara Whitfield's disappearance. New documentation. Reed's formal statement. Granger's supplemental summary of his post-retirement investigation selected excerpts from Thomas Whitfield's 30 years of recorded observation. The review would move slowly. It might not produce what could honestly be called resolution in the legal sense. But Clara Whitfield was in an active file maintained by someone whose professional obligation was to maintain it. Granger called to tell him this directly rather than through a message. Reed appreciated the directness. It may not go anywhere, Granger said. I want to be honest with you. I know, Reed said. But she's in the record. She's being maintained. Yes, Granger said. She is. A pause between 2 men who understood each other without requiring more than that. Thank you for coming to my door, Granger said. Reed thought about Thomas Whitfield in 1994 calling the one person who might understand, and the detective taking the call and saying the truest thing he could say in the language the situation allowed. I was the one who came, Reed said. That's all. He hung up and sat at the kitchen table in the November morning quiet of the house, Boone at his feet, the windows showing him the forest in its late-season configuration. The leaves mostly down now, the structure of the trees visible, in the way structure is only visible once the covering is gone. The weight he had been carrying was different, not gone. He had spent enough time around men who had tried to put things down to know that putting things down was not generally the available operation. But different. Something had been added to it or separated from it, or the act of tending someone else's carried weight alongside his own had changed his relationship to the whole of what he was carrying. He could not be more precise than that. He had decided that imprecise understanding was still understanding. He wrote in the mornings now, not a journal or a diary, something closer to the reports he had written for 15 years, factual and specific accounts of what had happened and in what order and what he had observed. He wrote about Clara Whitfield and Thomas and the chest and the marks on the floor. He wrote about Sawyer Holt, specific things that existed nowhere else in any documentary form, because he was the only one who had been there for them. He was building a record. It was a small record in a notebook on a kitchen table in a house at the end of a dirt road in the hills of West Virginia. But it existed, and as long as it existed, the people in it existed in some additional way beyond the way they lived in his memory alone. The memory would not last forever. He was clear-eyed about this. He would not last forever. But a record was different from a memory. A record could be found by whoever came after. On a morning in late November, the first morning that brought real snow to the higher elevations, Reed went up to the attic. He opened the chest. He lifted the bear out and held it for a moment, its lightness in its worn texture, the history of small hands that had loved it recorded in its surface. He put it back. He put the photograph beside it. He left the piece of paper where he had placed it. He closed the chest. He went to the small vent at the gable end and looked through it at the hillside behind the house. The first snow of the season sat on the branches of the trees, white against the brown and gray of them, the whole hillside quiet and present and indifferent in the magnificent way of large things that have been here longer than any of the grief they have witnessed. He had come to this house for silence. He had found something that required more than silence. Something that required him to be present and attentive and willing to hear what a place was holding and to hold it alongside it for as long as he was the person who was here. He went back down the ladder. Boone was waiting at the bottom and fell into step beside him as he walked toward the kitchen, where the coffee was still warm, and the notebook was on the table, and the window showed him the snowed-on hills of West Virginia going about the business of November with the patience of things that have been doing this for a very long time and expect to keep doing it long after any particular grief has run its course. Reed sat down at the table. He opened the notebook. He wrote the date at the top of the page. He thought about what to write, and then he wrote it the way he had learned to write things directly and without evasion, because directness was what he had, and it was enough, and the people he was writing about deserved at least that much from him. Outside, the snow continued to fall on the hills of Randolph County, covering the old marks in the ground and the old losses in the land and the old forest with its patient trees covering everything equally and without judgment, the way time covers things, which is to say, not erasing them, but changing what they look like from the outside so that you have to know what is underneath to understand what you are seeing. Reed knew what was underneath. He kept writing.